Welcome to the Flat Track Factory. On today's episode, we'll talk in detail about the electronic ignition system with Rev Limiter that is on the Rotax flat track framer that you often see featured on this channel. I'll tell you what it is, how it works, why it's needed, some of the unique challenges that a flat track racing motorcycle presents to a Rev Limiter, and a traction control trick. Stick around. We've spoken about this before, and I'll try to put a card up here that you may see on your phone or computer or the other way around. If not, there's a link in the description. That video will give you the nuts and bolts of how the system works and what it is. For this video, this is more of a higher end tuning of this system for racing purposes. I had a question about that, and I tried to answer it and realized that there's just too many caveats for racing purposes. So here we go. What is the system? Well, it has a fully electronic ignition curve. It's programmable, and then it has two rev limiters. One's called the soft limiter, one's called the hard. The soft limiter is adjustable, and you can put it anywhere you want. Once the engine reaches that speed, it begins to skip every third ignition pulse. Then, when it reaches your set hard limit point, it cuts ignition completely. Practically what that feels like is not universal. At some points in lower gears, at lower speeds, the engine can accelerate past a 1 out of 3 cut and continue to accelerate while on the limiter. In higher gears at higher speeds, it cannot overcome that. So it effectively becomes a hard limiter. And that we'll get into tuning a little bit later. The hard limiter obviously is a complete ignition cut. And for racing purposes, it's something to be avoided. It's not pleasant. Why is a rev limiter needed in this application? Many iterations of the Rotax, the engine could not rev fast enough to damage itself. And the piston weight, the rotating or the reciprocating mass of the piston was not such that it could overcome the strength of the crankshaft for how fast it can turn. As technologies have advanced, cylinder head development has moved on, and engines have had the capability of using heavier, larger pistons. You can reach that point at what would be considered normal revs. So long story short, if you have a big piston, all things being the same, your rev limit needs to come down a little bit. Again, I admit I'm not an engine guy. I'm going to talk to you like a racer. The additional advantage for this is the electronic ignition curve, which again, you can dig into details with that in the other video. I'll also try to put a card up here now and a link in the description to a video or 3 where you can actually hear this motorcycle with the rev limiter on the soft limit function. Sounds a little strange. One of the interesting features of using a rev limiter in flat track is this form of racing, we turn in, oftentimes, into the corner on the gas. And if you think about what that does on a motorcycle, if you've come to the end of the straightaway and you're on the top of the tire, remember motorcycle tires have a radius to them. If you're on the top of the tire, your effective gear ratio when you're going straight on the tall part of the tire is taller than when you turn the motorcycle in and roll off of the tall part of the tire to the small part of the tire. Your effective gear ratio changes. The gearing becomes shorter. So let's just say you're at 9 grand down the straightaway, and simply leaning the motorcycle to the left will require the engine to spin faster at the same mile an hour. So if your rev limiter is set such that it's going as fast as it can, you will lose ignition. It will go into the soft limiter. And in a really bad circumstance, as I alluded to before, it could hit the hard limiter and cut completely. That's bad. It feels really bad. So what happens as you turn into the corner, the bike begins to slide, the revs come up. If you don't have the hard limiter moved high enough above, suddenly the bike will stop running and catch and snap yourself straight, and then it'll have to wait a moment for it to catch back up. And effectively, when you're at the limit, that is just a split second, but it feels like an eternity. So what do you have to do? You have to get those soft limit points and hard limit points separated far enough that you don't run into that circumstance, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but again, we're talking about a big single cylinder application where the effective rev range is relatively small. You can get into debates with people as to, in the Rotax format, as to what's acceptable. I really leave that to engine builders, but I can tell you that we have a very long database in my case, or it's probably more like a rap sheet that my engine builder keeps on me when he tears them down, and the crank is always tweaked. How does that happen? Well, as the engine speed goes up, the crank gets pulled up by the piston and shoved down by the piston and is flexing like this as the piston's going up and down because the engine speed's too high for the strength of the crank, or the weight of the piston is too heavy for the strength of the crank. Or you can combine those two together and get a combination of them. Pistons have gotten bigger. Technology has moved on from 30 years ago, where we didn't have a cylinder head that could flow that much or pistons big enough to bend it. So this is the long story of why this is an issue. Combine that with the relatively narrow rev band range of a big cylinder, a single cylinder engine. We don't have a lot of room to wiggle, whereas your modern inline 4-cylinder 600cc crotch rocket may have a rev range over 13,000. This bike really can't really go any faster than, let's just say, 9. This takes us into attempting to answer the incredibly simple question of, yeah man, great, what do I set them at? Well, ultimately the hard cut should be as slightly slower than as fast as you've determined the engine can spin without damaging the crank. The soft limiter is very adjustable depending on the track that you're running. For example, if you're running at a short track where you're spinning the tire all the time, you might be able to just enact or move down that rev limiter to use it as a feature to tell you, hey, you're getting to this. Let's just say, I don't know, just for fun, 7,500. Even though your engine can go to 9,000 on a tiny short track where you're on the side of the tire the whole time, you're probably traction limited the entire way around, and you don't need all of that torque. You can save your engine and actually, to my last point, use this as a bit of traction control. You can torque limit this motorcycle by moving your soft limiter down, that you're hitting it sooner, and thereby farther down on the power curve where the bike is not wanting to violently spin as bad. So you basically tuned yourself with a rev limiter, knowing that, hey, okay, I shouldn't spin the tire any faster. Now we'll really get into the weeds here and talk about slip ratio and slip angle. And I may, with this, get one of my tire engineer buddies to come in and say something, or even correct me if I get this a little bit wrong. Again, I'm not an engineer, I'm a racer, and I dabble. I stay at a Holiday Inn once in a while, and I like to dabble in the engineering stuff to try to learn. So I'm going to share this with you. A flat track race tire, most race tires, all race tires probably, work best when they're spinning slightly. That's slip ratio. The ratio of the speed of the motorcycle versus the additional speed of the rear wheel. That's slip ratio, about 5%. In other words, it needs to be spinning about 5% faster than you're going for maximum grip. Any lower than that and you're not gaining maximum grip, spin it any faster than that and you're again losing grip. The slide, the sideways, also about 5%. That's slip angle. So you want the bike a little bit sideways. Not a lot and not none, just a little bit. So it needs to be spinning a little faster than you're actually going and sideways just a bit. There's an ideal, there's ideal numbers, an engineering number. Of course, when you get into turning the bike and track position and all these other things, there's all types of other caveats, but try to put all those aside and just talk about how does this go back to the rev limiter. Well, if you're on a a slippery short track, for example, where you have enough torque to spin the entire way around the racetrack, there's really no benefit to spinning it any faster. In fact, if you're buying into the slip ratio, if you're spinning it faster than 105% of your speed forward, you're not accelerating. You're just tearing the tire up, overheating the tire, and going backwards. So moving the rev limiter down, in my case, on slippery short tracks, I find that it helps me not spin the tire excessively. It's a bit of poor man's traction control. There's a deep, deep, deep dive into some ignition strategies and how we can use that soft limiter and avoid the hard limiter inside of a narrow engine speed that a big single can give you. Thanks for watching.